Commander Zythak adjusted his biosuit's filtration system as he reviewed the latest intelligence reports from the Terran sector. The holographic display showed a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, inhabited by what the Galactic Council had classified as a primitive bipedal species. The humans, as they called themselves, had only recently achieved faster-than-light travel and were requesting membership in the galactic community. "Pathetic," muttered his second-in-command, Lieutenant Vexhal, her chitinous exoskeleton clicking as she leaned over the data. "Look at their physical specifications. No natural armor, no venomous glands, no electromagnetic manipulation abilities. How did these soft-bodied creatures even survive long enough to develop spaceflight?" Zythak's 4 eyes studied the biological readouts with growing disdain. The humans were smaller than most sapient species, lacked any notable natural weapons, and appeared to be made of little more than fragile flesh and brittle bone. Their homeworld wasn't even particularly hostile by galactic standards. No acid rain, no predators larger than a few meters, no extreme gravitational forces. It was almost insulting that such a coddled species thought they belonged among the warrior races of the galaxy. "The Council wants us to conduct a standard military assessment," Zythak said, his mandibles clicking in what passed for amusement among his people. "Apparently, we need to determine if these humans have any combat value before granting them associate membership." The bridge crew of the battlecruiser Dominion's Edge erupted in what could only be described as laughter, though the sound was a mixture of growls, clicks, and harmonic vibrations that would have terrified most species. Zythak himself had earned his position through 3 decades of warfare across 12 star systems. His crew consisted of veterans from the hegemony's most elite units, Korthak shock troopers, Veltar assassins, and Noxhai heavy weapons specialists. The very idea that these humans could contribute anything meaningful to galactic defense was laughable. The hegemony controlled over 400 star systems through military might alone. They had conquered species with natural armor that could deflect energy weapons, creatures that could regenerate from nearly fatal wounds, and beings that could survive in the vacuum of space. What could a species of soft pink creatures possibly offer? "Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the human vessel," reported Navigation Officer Krell-Ath, his translator implant struggling with the alien phonetics. "They're requesting permission to dock for the joint training exercise." Zythak straightened in his command chair, the biomechanical interface reading his neural patterns and adjusting the ship's systems accordingly. "Permission granted. Have them dock at Bay 7, the one we use for cargo vessels. It seems appropriate." As the human ship approached, Zythak watched through the external cameras with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. The vessel was tiny compared to his battlecruiser, barely the size of a hegemony shuttle. Its hull appeared to be constructed from primitive metal alloys rather than the living bioarmor that protected proper warships. There were no visible weapon ports, no energy shields flickering along its surface, no signs of the devastating firepower that marked a true military vessel. "How many humans are aboard that pathetic craft?" Vexhal asked, her sensory tendrils twitching with what Zythak recognized as barely contained aggression. "According to their manifest, 12 individuals," Krell-Ath replied. "They claim it's a full military unit." The bridge fell silent for a moment before erupting in another round of harsh laughter. 12 individuals? Zythak's own security detail consisted of 50 battle-hardened warriors, and that was considered a minimal force for a ship of this class. The humans either had a severely inflated opinion of their own capabilities or no understanding of proper military protocols. The docking procedures took longer than expected, as the human ship lacked the standard bioneural interfaces that allowed hegemony vessels to communicate directly with docking systems. Instead, they relied on primitive radio transmissions and manual piloting. Zythak found himself growing impatient as the minutes ticked by. each delay reinforcing his conviction that these creatures were hopelessly backward. When the airlock finally cycled open, Zithak made his way to the docking bay with a small entourage of his senior officers. He wanted to see these legendary humans with his own optical organs to understand what delusion had convinced the Galactic Council that such creatures deserved consideration. The first human through the airlock immediately challenged every preconception Zithak had formed. The creature stood upright on two legs, as expected, but moved with a fluid grace that suggested excellent muscle control and spatial awareness. Its skin was indeed soft and pink, lacking any visible natural armor, but its bearing radiated confidence and alertness. Most surprising of all were its eyes. Small by galactic standards, but they tracked constantly, taking in every detail of the docking bay with an intensity that Zithak recognized from his most experienced reconnaissance specialists. "Commander Zithak," the human said, its voice carrying clearly through the bay's atmosphere despite the creature's obvious respiratory limitations. "I'm Major Sarah Chen, commanding the Terran Assessment Team. Thank you for agreeing to this joint exercise." The human's translator was surprisingly sophisticated, rendering its words into perfect hegemony standard without the usual delays and linguistic artifacts that plagued most non-native speakers. Zithak studied the creature more closely, noting details that the intelligence reports had somehow missed. While the human appeared physically fragile, its posture and movements suggested years of combat training. Its equipment, while clearly primitive by hegemony standards, showed signs of careful maintenance and practical modification. "Major Chen," Zithak replied, allowing a note of condescension to color his words. "Welcome aboard the Dominion's Edge. I trust your vessel's life support systems proved adequate for the journey?" If the human detected the insult, it showed no visible reaction. Instead, it smiled, an expression that Zithak's cultural database identified as indicating pleasure or amusement. "Our ships may not be as advanced as yours, Commander, but they get us where we need to go. I understand we'll be participating in a combat simulation to demonstrate human tactical capabilities." "Indeed," Vexhal interjected, her voice carrying the harmonic undertones that indicated barely restrained predatory instincts. "Though I confess we're curious to see what tactics creatures of your physical limitations might employ against proper warriors." The remaining 11 humans had filed into the bay during this exchange, and Zithak took the opportunity to study them more carefully. They varied in size and coloration more than he had expected, suggesting significant genetic diversity within the species. Some appeared to be male and others female, based on the biological markers his database provided. All carried themselves with the same confident bearing as their leader, and all bore equipment that showed clear signs of heavy use and careful maintenance. Physical limitations can be overcome through intelligence, teamwork, and determination, Major Chen replied calmly. "We found that superior firepower isn't always the determining factor in combat success." Zithak's mandibles clicked in what his species considered polite disagreement. In his experience, superior firepower was almost always the determining factor in combat. The hegemony had built its empire on the principle that overwhelming force applied at the right moment could solve virtually any tactical problem. These humans, with their soft bodies and primitive weapons, seemed to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of warfare. "We shall see," he said. "Your team will be facing a standard hegemony assault unit in a simulated urban environment. The scenario involves securing a strategic position while defending against superior numbers. You will have access to standard simulation weapons and equipment." "Understood," Major Chen nodded. "When do we begin?" "Immediately," Zithak replied. "My crew is eager to see what passes for military prowess among your species." As they made their way through the ship's corridors toward the simulation chamber, Zithak noted how the humans moved as a unit. They maintained proper spacing, covered each other's movements, and constantly monitored their surroundings, despite being in presumably safe territory. Their discipline was impressive, even if their physical capabilities remained questionable. The simulation chamber was a marvel of hegemony technology, capable of creating fully immersive environments that perfectly replicated real battlefield conditions. For this exercise, Zythak had programmed an urban setting based on the contested city of Velcom from the Third Expansion War. The environment featured multiple levels, numerous choke points, and plenty of opportunities for both tactical advancement and devastating ambushes. Your opposition will consist of 24 Korthak warriors, Zythak explained as the humans examined their assigned equipment. They are considered elite troops among our military forces. Each stands over 2 meters tall, possesses natural armor capable of deflecting most small arms fire, and carries weapons that can punch through reinforced fortifications. Major Chen picked up one of the simulation rifles, checking its balance and sight alignment with practiced efficiency. "What's our objective?" "Simple," Vex Hall replied, her voice carrying clear anticipation. "Survive for 30 minutes while preventing the Korthak from securing the Central Command building. If even one of your team members reaches the objective and maintains control until time expires, you will be considered successful." The human leader nodded thoughtfully, then began speaking to her team in rapid, quiet tones. Zythak's translator caught fragments of the conversation, references to overwatch positions, fire and movement, and force multiplication. But the humans were clearly using tactical terminology that didn't translate well into hegemony standard. As the simulation began, Zythak settled into the observation booth with his senior officers to watch what he expected would be a very brief and educational demonstration of human inadequacy. The holographic displays showed both the human positions and the approaching Korthak force from multiple angles, providing a comprehensive view of the developing tactical situation. The Korthak advanced in their traditional formation, a dispersed line that maximized their individual combat effectiveness while maintaining mutual support. They moved with the confidence of warriors who had never met an enemy they couldn't overwhelm through sheer physical superiority. Their weapons were already charged and ready, their armor systems fully activated. What happened next would forever change Zythak's understanding of warfare and the species he had so casually dismissed. The humans had scattered throughout the urban environment in a pattern that initially made no tactical sense to any of the observers. Instead of concentrating their forces to create a strong defensive position, they had spread themselves thin across multiple buildings and levels. Several appeared to have taken positions that offered no clear fields of fire toward the central objective. "Foolish," muttered Krelath. "They've abandoned any hope of mutual support. The Korthak will destroy them piecemeal." But as the first Korthak warriors entered the simulation zone, the human strategy began to reveal itself. The scattered positions weren't random. They were carefully coordinated to create overlapping fields of observation and fire that covered every possible approach to the central building. When the Korthak attempted their traditional frontal advance, they found themselves taking precision fire from multiple directions simultaneously. "Impossible," Vex Hall hissed. "The simulation weapons shouldn't be powerful enough to penetrate Korthak armor." Yet the tactical display clearly showed Korthak warriors falling as the humans exploited gaps in their natural protection with surgically precise marksmanship. Instead of trying to punch through the armor, the humans were targeting joints, sensory organs, and other vulnerable points that even the most heavily protected warrior couldn't completely defend. More disturbing was the way the humans seemed to anticipate Korthak movements. Every time the assault force attempted to flank a position, they found human weapons waiting for them. Every attempt to suppress one firing position resulted in increased fire from 2 others. The humans weren't just reacting to Korthak tactics, they were staying several steps ahead of them. "How are they coordinating their movements?" Zythak demanded. Our sensors aren't detecting any communications between their positions. His communications officer checked the monitoring systems again. Sir, they appear to be using hand signals and movement patterns instead of electronic communications. Our systems weren't calibrated to intercept such primitive methods. Primitive, perhaps, but devastatingly effective. The humans had created a communications network that was completely invisible to hegemony detection systems. They were sharing tactical information in real time while remaining electronically silent, a capability that none of Zythak's forces possessed. As the simulation progressed, the Korthak force found itself trapped in an increasingly deadly maze. Every street became a killing field, every building a potential sniper's nest. The humans moved constantly, never remaining in one position long enough for the Korthak to bring their superior firepower to bear. When pressed, they would fade away like smoke, only to reappear in an entirely different location. "Sir," the tactical officer reported, his voice tight with disbelief. "We've lost 16 Korthak warriors. The humans haven't suffered a single casualty." Zythak stared at the displays in growing shock. This couldn't be happening. The Korthak were elite warriors, veterans of a dozen successful campaigns. They were stronger, better armored, and more heavily armed than their opponents. By every measure that mattered, they should have crushed the human force within minutes of making contact. Instead, they were being systematically destroyed by an enemy that refused to fight by the established rules of galactic warfare. The final phase of the simulation began with only 8 Korthak warriors still combat effective. They had managed to reach the perimeter of the central building, but their advance had cost them dearly. The humans had turned the urban environment into a weapon against them, using everything from reflected weapon fire to improvised obstacles to multiply their own effectiveness. "They're going to lose," Vexhall said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. 8 Korthak can still overwhelm 12 humans in direct combat. The humans seemed to disagree. Instead of meeting the final Korthak charge head-on, they began what could only be described as a coordinated withdrawal. But it wasn't a retreat. It was a carefully orchestrated fighting withdrawal that drew the surviving Korthak into an increasingly narrow kill zone around the central building. When the final confrontation came, it lasted exactly 37 seconds. The Korthak warriors, frustrated by hours of fighting an enemy they couldn't pin down, finally abandoned their tactical discipline and charged the building in a desperate attempt to achieve their objective. They ran directly into a crossfire from 6 different positions that eliminated them before they could reach the entrance. The simulation ended with all 12 humans alive and in control of their objective. 24 elite Korthak warriors had been eliminated without inflicting a single casualty on their opponents. The observation booth was completely silent for several long minutes. Finally, Zythak found his voice. "Run the simulation again," he ordered. "There must have been a malfunction in the program." The second simulation produced identical results. So did the third. By the end of the day, Zythak's confidence in the fundamental principles that had guided his military career was shattered completely. As he watched Major Chen and her team prepare to return to their ship, Zythak realized that he was looking at representatives of a species that understood warfare in ways that the hegemony had never considered. They had taken their physical weaknesses and turned them into tactical advantages. They had used their limitations to force their enemies into fighting on unfavorable terms. Most disturbing of all, they had done it so efficiently that it looked effortless. For the first time in his military career, Commander Zythak experienced something that he had thought was reserved for prey species and civilian populations. He felt afraid. 3 months after the simulation that had shattered his worldview, Commander Zythak found himself standing in the war room of Hegemony High Command, staring at tactical displays that painted an increasingly grim picture of the galactic situation. The Devourers had returned. The ancient enemy had emerged from the galactic void without warning, their bioships consuming entire star systems as they carved a path of destruction through the Outer Rim territories. 17 colonies had been completely sterilized, their populations either consumed or converted into more devourer biomass. The hegemony's most powerful battle fleets had engaged the enemy twice, and twice they had been forced to retreat after suffering catastrophic losses. "The situation is critical," Admiral Kolvash declared, her scarred carapace bearing testament to decades of warfare against the galaxy's most dangerous enemies. "Our traditional tactics are proving ineffective against devourer adaptive capabilities. They learn from each engagement, evolving countermeasures to our weapons and strategies faster than we can develop new ones." Zythak studied the star charts with growing unease. The red zones indicating devourer control had expanded significantly since the morning briefing, and intelligence reports suggested that the enemy's advance was actually accelerating. At this rate, core hegemony worlds would be under direct threat within 6 months. "What about the other major powers?" asked General Vector, commander of the 5th Assault Legion. "The Crystalline Syndicate has ships that could be useful, and the Psi Masters Guild has proven effective against bio-entities in the past." "Already contacted," Admiral Kolvash replied grimly. "The Syndicate is focusing entirely on defending their own territories, and the Psi Masters are claiming that devourer mental patterns are too alien for their techniques to be effective. We're essentially facing this threat alone." The war room fell silent as the assembled commanders absorbed this information. The hegemony had built its empire through military superiority, but even their greatest victories had relied on having allies or at least neutral parties who could provide strategic resources. Fighting the devourers without any external support was a scenario that their strategic doctrine had never seriously considered. "Sir," Lieutenant Vexhal spoke from her position at the communications console, "we're receiving a transmission from Terran Command. They're requesting permission to deploy a military contingent to assist with anti-devourer operations." Every head in the room turned toward the communication station. The humans had been granted provisional membership in the Galactic Council following their performance in the military assessment, but most species still considered them a minor power at best. The idea that they would volunteer to fight against the most dangerous enemy the galaxy had ever known was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. "How large a force are they offering?" Admiral Kolvash asked. Vexhal consulted her displays. "According to their message, they can deploy a full regiment, approximately 3,000 personnel, along with supporting equipment and naval assets." General Vector's mandibles clicked in what could have been amusement or disbelief. 3,000 humans against an enemy that has destroyed entire fleets? What do they think they can accomplish? But Zythak remembered the simulation, remembered watching 12 humans eliminate 24 elite Korthak warriors without suffering a single casualty. He remembered the fear that had settled into his bones as he realized that everything he thought he knew about warfare was incomplete. "Accept their offer," he said quietly. The war room erupted in surprised chittering and harmonic protests. Admiral Kolvash raised one armored appendage for silence. "Commander Zythak, explain your reasoning." Zythak activated the holographic projector and called up the simulation recordings that he had studied obsessively over the past 3 months. The tactical display showed the urban battlefield where his understanding of human capabilities had been forever altered. During their military assessment, the humans demonstrated tactical capabilities that surpass anything in our current doctrine, he began. "They don't fight like any species we've encountered before. They use their weaknesses as strengths, turn disadvantages into tactical advantages, and coordinate their forces in ways that our sensors can barely detect." He paused the playback at the moment when the Korthak warriors began their final doomed charge. "More importantly, they think differently than we do. The Devourers adapt to our tactics because our tactics are fundamentally similar. Overwhelming force applied through superior technology. But human warfare is based on entirely different principles. Admiral Kolvash studied the tactical recordings with the keen attention of a career military officer. These results are impressive, but simulation performance doesn't always translate to real combat effectiveness. With respect, Admiral, I disagree, Zythak replied. I've reviewed every available piece of human military history, and their actual combat record is even more remarkable than their simulation performance. They've been fighting each other for thousands of years, using increasingly sophisticated tactics. They've had to develop ways to win against superior numbers, better equipment, and stronger opponents because they've never been the dominant military power on their own planet. He activated a new series of displays showing historical human conflicts. Look at these battle records. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans held off an army of hundreds of thousands. At the Battle of Rorke's Drift, 150 British soldiers defeated 4,000 Zulu warriors. At Stalingrad, an entire human city became a weapon that destroyed the most powerful military machine their species had ever created. The war room had grown quiet as the assembled officers absorbed this information. The tactical recordings showed patterns of warfare that were simultaneously alien and disturbingly effective. They don't just fight, Zythak continued. They turn fighting into an art form. They study their enemies, adapt to new situations, and find ways to win even when victory should be impossible. If any species in the galaxy can develop new tactics to counter devourer adaptation, it's the humans. Admiral Kolvash considered this for several long moments. Very well. Inform Terran Command that we accept their offer. Commander Zythak, you'll serve as their liaison officer. Try to learn what you can about their methods. 2 weeks later, Zythak found himself aboard the Terran vessel Indomitable, watching human military personnel prepare for what many considered a suicide mission. The ship was smaller than a hegemony cruiser, but packed with technologies that defied easy categorization. Everything seemed designed with redundancy and adaptability in mind, as if the humans expected their equipment to be damaged or destroyed during normal operations. Colonel James Morrison, the human commanding officer, was reviewing tactical intelligence with his staff when Zythak entered the briefing room. Unlike the rigid hierarchies that characterized hegemony military structure, the human command staff seemed to encourage input from personnel of all ranks. Junior officers freely offered suggestions and challenges to their superiors' plans, creating a dynamic that looked chaotic, but somehow produced remarkably sophisticated tactical solutions. Commander Zythak. Colonel Morrison stood and offered his hand in the human gesture of greeting. Welcome aboard. We're just finishing our analysis of the latest Devourer activity reports. Zythak had grown accustomed to the human practice of physical contact during greetings, though it still felt strange to touch another sapient being without hostile intent. Thank you for including me, Colonel. I'm hoping to learn more about human tactical approaches before we reach the combat zone. Excellent. Morrison gestured toward the tactical display. We've been studying devourer behavior patterns, and we think we've identified some potential vulnerabilities in their adaptive responses. The display showed the locations of recent devourer attacks, color-coded by date and intensity. What immediately struck Zythak was the level of detail in the human analysis. Where hegemony intelligence reports focused on enemy strengths and defensive capabilities, the humans seemed primarily interested in behavioral patterns and reaction times. Your people have been fighting the Devourers for months, Morrison continued. You've learned that they adapt to direct confrontation very quickly, but adaptation takes time and energy. If we can force them to adapt to multiple different tactical approaches simultaneously, we might be able to overwhelm their response capabilities. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, now promoted and serving as Morrison's intelligence officer, activated additional displays showing proposed human tactics. We call it tactical saturation. Instead of using one coordinated strategy, we employed dozens of different approaches across multiple engagement zones. The enemy can adapt to any single tactic, but adapting to everything at once should strain their resources. Zethak studied the proposed battle plans with growing amazement. The humans weren't planning to fight the Devourers directly. Instead, they intended to create a situation where the enemy's greatest strength, their adaptive capability, became a liability. "This is incredibly sophisticated," he admitted. "But you're planning to spread your forces across an enormous area. How will you maintain coordination and mutual support?" Morrison and Chen exchanged glances that Zethak had learned to recognize as indicating shared understanding. "We don't," Morrison said simply. "Each unit operates independently with broad strategic objectives but complete tactical freedom. They adapt to local conditions and exploit opportunities as they arise. Central coordination would just slow down our response times." This was revolutionary thinking by hegemony standards. Every major military doctrine in the galaxy emphasized central command and coordinated operations. The idea of deliberately fragmenting your forces and trusting individual unit commanders to make critical decisions without oversight was almost unthinkable. "How do you prevent your units from working at cross purposes?" Zethak asked. "Training and trust," Chen replied. "Our officers spend years learning to think like their peers, to anticipate how other human commanders will react to specific situations. We don't need constant communication because we all learned the same fundamental principles." As the Indomitable and its escort vessels approached the outer rim, Zethak found himself spending more and more time observing human military preparations. The humans trained constantly, but their exercises were unlike anything he had seen in hegemony forces. Instead of drilling specific tactical maneuvers, they practiced adapting to unexpected situations. They would begin an exercise with one set of objectives and equipment, then introduce random complications that forced them to completely redesign their approach. "We call it chaos training," explained Major Rodriguez, the human battalion commander. "The enemy never attacks exactly the way you expect, so we practice handling unexpected situations until improvisation becomes instinctive." The human soldiers themselves were as remarkable as their officers. They came from different backgrounds and cultures, spoke different languages, and had wildly different personal combat styles. Yet they functioned together, with an efficiency that surpassed even the most elite hegemony units. They seemed to thrive on the kind of uncertainty and confusion that paralyzed other species' military forces. When the convoy finally reached the combat zone, Zethak got his first close look at a Devourer bioship. The massive organism was over 2 kilometers long, its hull a shifting mass of adaptive tissue that constantly reconfigured itself in response to external stimuli. Weapon ports opened and closed like breathing orifices, while sensory tendrils extended to taste the electromagnetic spectrum for signs of approaching threats. "Beautiful, in a terrifying way," Morrison observed as they watched the alien vessel consume the remains of a destroyed asteroid mining station. "Look how efficiently it processes raw matter into useful biomass. No waste, no excess energy expenditure. It's like a perfect biological machine." Zethak found the humans' admiration for their enemy disturbing. In his experience, effective warriors hated their opponents, or at least maintained clinical detachment. The humans seemed genuinely fascinated by Devourer capabilities, studying them with the same intensity they applied to their own tactical development. "Doesn't their efficiency concern you?" he asked. "Of course," Morrison replied, "but understanding your enemy is the first step toward defeating them. The Devourers are incredibly effective, but effectiveness can become predictability if you study it long enough." The first engagement came without warning. Devourer scout organisms detected the human convoy and immediately began transmitting tactical information to the larger bioships. Within minutes, Three massive vessels were converging on the human position with the kind of coordinated precision that had devastated hegemony fleets. Zethak braced himself for the conventional engagement he expected, ships forming battle lines, exchanging long-range fire until one side achieved decisive advantage. Instead, the humans did something completely unprecedented. They scattered. The convoy dissolved into dozens of individual vessels, each following a different trajectory and employing different defensive measures. Some ships activated stealth systems and disappeared from sensors entirely. Others began broadcasting false signatures that made them appear to be completely different classes of vessel. A few actually accelerated toward the Devourer ships, acting like missiles rather than crewed spacecraft. "What are you doing?" Zethak demanded as the bridge crew worked frantically to coordinate this apparently chaotic maneuver. "Creating problems," Morrison replied calmly. "Each ship is now presenting the enemy with a different tactical challenge. They can't adapt to all of them simultaneously without degrading their response to any individual threat." On the tactical display, Zethak watched the Devourer ships struggle to respond to the fragmented attack. Their adaptive systems kept switching between different configurations, trying to optimize for multiple threat types that were constantly changing. Instead of presenting a unified, overwhelming response, they began to show signs of tactical confusion. The human ships pressed their advantage mercilessly. Stealth vessels appeared behind Devourer formations to deliver precise strikes against sensory nodes. The false signature ships drew defensive fire away from actual attack vessels. The missile ships penetrated deep into enemy formations before revealing their true nature and unleashing devastating close-range attacks. But the most remarkable aspect of the engagement was how the scattered human units continued to support each other without any apparent coordination. Ships would appear exactly where they were needed to exploit weaknesses created by other units. Defensive positions would be established just in time to cover retreating vessels. It was as if the entire human force was controlled by a single tactical intelligence, even though Zethak knew they were operating under complete communications silence. The engagement lasted 4 hours and ended with all 3 Devourer bioships either destroyed or retreating in severely damaged condition. The human force had suffered casualties, 7 ships lost and dozens damaged, but they had achieved something that no other galactic military had managed. They had defeated a superior Devourer force in open combat. As damage reports came in and the human crews began their post-battle analysis, Zethak realized that he had just witnessed the future of galactic warfare. The humans hadn't just won a battle, they had demonstrated a completely new paradigm for military operations. "How?" he asked Morrison as the colonel reviewed tactical recordings. "How did your ships coordinate so effectively without communications?" Morrison smiled. An expression that Zethak had learned indicated satisfaction rather than aggression. "We didn't coordinate, Commander. We synchronized. Every one of our officers trained for years to understand how their colleagues think, how they respond to specific tactical situations. When you truly understand your allies, you don't need to communicate with them. You know what they're going to do before they do it." For the second time in his military career, Zethak felt the cold grip of fear. But this time, the fear came with something else: hope. If the humans could teach other species to fight the way they fought, the Devourers might finally face an enemy they couldn't adapt to fast enough. 6 months of fighting alongside humans had transformed Commander Zethak's understanding of warfare so completely that he barely recognized the officer he had been before first meeting Major Chen and her team. The timid creature who had dismissed human capabilities based on their physical appearance now served as the primary liaison between Terran forces and the reformed Galactic Defense Coalition, helping to train alien military units in what the humans called adaptive warfare doctrine. The classroom aboard the orbital training facility at Kepler Station buzzed with nervous energy as representatives from 17 different species prepared for their final examination. Korthak warriors sat beside delicate crystalline scouts, while Veltar assassins shared tactical notes with hulking Noxhai heavy weapon specialists. The diversity of the student body would have been unthinkable under the old hegemony system, where each species maintained strict separation of their military assets. Today's exercise will test your ability to implement human tactical principles against a simulated devourer force, Zethak announced, his voice carrying clearly through the universal translators that allowed this unprecedented level of interspecies cooperation. Remember, the enemy adapts to conventional tactics within minutes of first contact. Your success will depend on how well you've internalized the lessons of flexibility, improvisation, and independent thinking. In the 6 months since the first successful human engagement with devourer forces, the tactical landscape of the galaxy had been revolutionized. Traditional military hierarchies were being replaced by fluid command structures that emphasized individual initiative. Massive, heavily armed battle fleets were giving way to smaller, more maneuverable task forces that could adapt to changing battlefield conditions in real time. The transformation hadn't been easy. Many species struggled with the human concept of deliberately fragmenting their forces and trusting individual commanders to make critical decisions without oversight. The Korthak, in particular, had difficulty abandoning their traditional emphasis on overwhelming frontal assault in favor of the subtle, multi-layered approaches that human doctrine demanded. "Commander," called out Warrior Prime Gakthos, one of the Korthak trainees, "my people have natural armor and superior strength. Why should we abandon tactics that emphasize our advantages?" Zethak had heard variations of this question from every species represented in the training program. Each race had developed military doctrines that played to their particular biological strengths, and asking them to adopt radically different approaches felt like asking them to discard millions of years of evolutionary advantage. "Because the devourers adapt to those advantages," Zethak replied, activating the holographic display that showed recordings from the Battle of Vegan Prime. "Watch how quickly they develop countermeasures to conventional Korthak assault tactics." The recording showed a Korthak heavy assault unit engaging a devourer bioship using traditional frontal assault doctrine. For the first few minutes of the engagement, their superior armor and firepower gave them a significant advantage. But as the battle progressed, the devourer ship began modifying its weapon systems to penetrate Korthak armor more effectively. By the end of the encounter, the bioship had developed projectiles specifically designed to exploit the joint articulation points in Korthak natural armor. "Your strength became a liability because it was predictable," Zethak continued. "The devourers learned to counter it because you used it the same way every time. Human doctrine teaches us to use our advantages unpredictably, to combine them with capabilities that shouldn't work together, to create tactical situations that the enemy can't categorize and therefore can't effectively adapt to." He switched to a different recording, this one showing a mixed-species task force implementing human tactical principles against a devourer fleet near the Rigel system. The force included Korthak warriors, but instead of serving as traditional heavy assault troops, they were scattered throughout the formation in small teams that provided mobile fire support and close-quarters combat capability to more fragile units. "See how the Korthak strength is being used here," Zethak pointed out. "Instead of concentrating your warriors in an obvious assault formation, they're distributed as force multipliers for other units. The Devourers can't adapt to Korthak assault tactics because you're not using traditional Korthak assault tactics. You're using Korthak capabilities in ways that no one has ever used them before." The alien students studied the tactical recordings with varying degrees of comprehension. Some species, particularly those with naturally flexible social structures, grasped the concepts quickly. Others, especially races that had evolved rigid hierarchical instincts, struggled to understand why deliberate unpredictability could be more effective than time-tested traditional approaches. Scout singer Velhan of the Crystalline Syndicate raised one of her translucent appendages to request attention. "Commander Zythak, our people excel at long-range reconnaissance and electromagnetic manipulation. How do we apply human doctrine to abilities that are inherently specialized?" This was exactly the kind of question that demonstrated real understanding of the principles involved. Zythak felt a surge of satisfaction as he prepared to address it. "Excellent question, Scout Singer. Human doctrine doesn't require you to abandon your specialized capabilities. Instead, it asks you to use those capabilities in unexpected ways. Show me how crystalline scouts traditionally operate." Velhan activated her personal hologram projector, displaying standard crystalline reconnaissance procedures. "We establish observation posts at maximum sensor range, maintain constant surveillance of target areas, and provide detailed intelligence reports to command elements for tactical planning." "Effective, but predictable," Zythak observed. "The Devourers have learned to detect crystalline sensor signatures and either avoid observed areas or target the scouts directly. How might you modify these procedures to create uncertainty for the enemy?" The crystalline scout considered this for several moments, her internal light patterns shifting through sequences that indicated deep thought. "We could vary our observation patterns. Instead of maintaining constant surveillance, we could establish brief observation windows at unpredictable intervals." "Better," Zythak encouraged. "What else?" "We could use our electromagnetic manipulation abilities to create false sensor signatures, making the enemy think we're observing areas that we're actually not monitoring." "Excellent. And?" Velhan's light patterns accelerated as she warmed to the concept. "We could position ourselves within enemy formations instead of at maximum range, using our transparency to avoid detection while providing real-time tactical intelligence directly to combat units." "Now you're thinking like a human," Zythak said approvingly. "You're taking your natural advantages and using them in ways that create tactical problems the enemy can't solve through simple adaptation. You're forcing them to develop multiple different countermeasures, each of which has to account for capabilities they've never encountered in that particular tactical context." The lesson continued for several more hours, with each species working through the process of reimagining their traditional military roles through the lens of human adaptive doctrine. By the end of the session, even the most hidebound traditionalists were beginning to see possibilities they had never considered before. As the students filed out to prepare for their final practical examination, Zythak remained behind to review the lesson recordings. The transformation he was witnessing went far beyond simple tactical innovation. The humans weren't just teaching new methods of warfare, they were teaching entirely new ways of thinking about conflict itself. A soft chime indicated an incoming priority message, and Zythak activated his communication console to find Colonel Morrison's face appearing in holographic detail. The human officer looked tired but satisfied, with the expression of someone who had just received extremely good news. "Commander, I thought you'd want to hear this immediately," Morrison began without preamble. "The mixed species task force we trained last month just successfully defended the Altair system against a major Devourer incursion, 12 bioships, including 2 of the new heavy adaptation variants." Zythak felt his respiratory system accelerate with excitement. The Altair system was a critical strategic position, and previous attempts to defend it had resulted in the complete destruction of 3 separate hegemony battle fleets. "Casualties?" he asked. "Light," Morrison replied, unable to suppress a smile. "The task force lost 4 ships total, and they managed to completely destroy 8 of the bioships while driving off the remaining 4. More importantly, the engagement lasted over 12 hours, and the Devourers were never able to achieve effective adaptation to the mixed species tactical approaches. This was unprecedented. No previous engagement with Devourer forces had lasted more than 6 hours before the enemy's adaptive capabilities gave them decisive advantage. The fact that a mixed-species force had not only survived, but actually achieved tactical superiority in an extended engagement represented a fundamental shift in the balance of galactic power. "How did they do it?" Zithak asked. Morrison's smile widened. "They followed human doctrine perfectly. Instead of operating as separate species-specific units, they completely integrated their capabilities into something entirely new. Korthak warriors provided close support for crystalline scouts who were embedded directly in enemy formations. Veltar assassins used their stealth capabilities to deliver Nox-High heavy weapons to unexpected locations. Hegemony bioships served as mobile platforms for rapid deployment of mixed-species strike teams. The Devourers couldn't adapt because they couldn't categorize what they were fighting against, Zithak realized. Exactly. Every time they started to develop countermeasures for one tactical approach, the task force would shift to a completely different combination of capabilities. The enemy adaptation systems were constantly trying to catch up with threats that kept evolving faster than their response time could handle. This was the validation that Zithak had hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. The training program was working. Species that had fought as separate competing factions for thousands of years were learning to combine their abilities in ways that created tactical capabilities greater than the sum of their individual parts. "There's more," Morrison continued. "Intelligence reports indicate that the Devourers are beginning to modify their overall strategic approach. Instead of advancing directly toward core systems, they're starting to avoid areas where mixed-species forces are known to be operating. They're actually changing their expansion patterns to route around our new tactical capabilities. For a species that had terrorized the galaxy through their ability to adapt to any military challenge, the Devourers were now facing something they had never encountered before. An enemy that adapted faster than they could counter-adapt. Human tactical doctrine wasn't just providing new ways to fight the ancient threat, it was forcing the enemy to acknowledge that they could no longer count on their primary strategic advantage. "Commander," Morrison's voice took on a more serious tone, "there's something else you need to know. The Galactic Council has approved expansion of the training program. They want to establish similar facilities in every major star system, with the goal of converting all galactic military forces to integrated multi-species doctrine within 2 years. Zithak felt a mixture of pride and trepidation. The success of the program was gratifying, but the scope of what they were being asked to accomplish was staggering. They weren't just training individual units anymore. They were restructuring the entire foundation of galactic military organization. The Council is also requesting that you accept promotion to Admiral and overall command of the training initiative, Morrison added. Apparently, your combination of traditional hegemony military experience and expertise in human tactical doctrine makes you uniquely qualified to oversee this kind of systemic transformation. Admiral Zithak. 6 months ago, he had been a mid-level commander whose greatest accomplishment was maintaining discipline aboard a single battlecruiser. Now he was being asked to reshape the military capabilities of 17 different species and coordinate the largest military training program in galactic history. "I'll need human advisors," he said after a moment of consideration. "Our people understand the technical aspects of your doctrine, but we're still learning to think the way you think. Without human guidance, we risk turning adaptive warfare into just another rigid tactical system." "Already anticipated," Morrison replied. "The Terran Defense Force is assigning a full regiment of military advisors to the expanded program. We'll have human officers embedded with every training facility, working directly with local instructors to ensure that the principles are properly transmitted." As the communication ended, Zithak found himself alone with the magnitude of what they were attempting. The humans had done more than provide new tactical methods. They had offered the galaxy a completely different philosophy of warfare. Instead of fighting to achieve dominance through superior force, they fought to create situations where dominance became irrelevant. Instead of seeking to overpower their enemies, they sought to make themselves unpowerable. It was a subtle but profound distinction, and one that required fundamental changes in how every species understood conflict itself. The humans had learned these lessons through thousands of years of fighting each other, developing increasingly sophisticated ways to overcome apparently insurmountable odds. Now they were teaching those same lessons to species that had never faced existential threats to their survival. The irony wasn't lost on Zithak. The species he had initially dismissed as weak and primitive had turned out to possess the strongest military doctrine in the galaxy. Their apparent physical limitations had forced them to develop mental capabilities that made traditional concepts of strength and weakness completely obsolete. A year ago, he had felt fear when he first realized what humans were capable of in combat. Now he felt a different kind of fear. The fear of failure in the face of enormous responsibility. The survival of galactic civilization might well depend on how effectively they could spread human tactical principles throughout the existing military structure. But along with the fear came something else, a confidence born of experience. He had seen Korthak warriors learn to use their strength with subtlety. He had watched crystalline scouts discover new applications for abilities they had possessed for millennia. He had observed species with radically different evolutionary backgrounds learn to fight together as unified forces. If creatures as different as humans and hegemony officers could learn to understand each other well enough to fight effectively together, then perhaps any species could learn to adapt to the challenges they faced. The final examination began the next morning with a simulated engagement that was designed to test every principle the students had learned over the past 6 months. The scenario involved a mixed-species task force defending a critical supply depot against a massive devourer assault force that included several new bioship variants with previously unknown capabilities. Zithak observed from the command center as 18 different tactical teams, each representing a different combination of species and specializations, responded to the developing threat. The early stages of the engagement looked chaotic to eyes trained in traditional military doctrine. Units scattered across the battle space without apparent coordination, communications remained minimal, and there was no clear command hierarchy directing overall strategy. But as the simulation progressed, the underlying logic of human tactical doctrine began to assert itself. The scattered units weren't operating independently. They were creating a complex, multi-layered defensive matrix that forced the simulated devourer forces to deal with dozens of different tactical challenges simultaneously. When the enemy adaptation algorithms began optimizing for one type of threat, they would find their solutions ineffective against the completely different challenges being presented by other units. Attempts to concentrate forces against apparent weak points in the defense resulted in devastating crossfires from units that had appeared to be out of position. Every tactical advantage that the simulation granted to the devourer forces was systematically neutralized by defensive responses that the enemy's programming couldn't predict or counter. The engagement lasted 8 simulated hours and ended with the complete destruction of the attacking force at minimal cost to the defenders. More importantly, the post-engagement analysis showed that the students had successfully internalized the core principles of adaptive warfare. They had stopped thinking like members of individual species and started thinking like components of a larger tactical organism. As Zithak reviewed the final performance evaluations, he realized that they had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. 17 different species, representing millions of years of separate evolution and thousands of years of separate military development, had learned to fight together as effectively as humans fought among themselves. The transformation was complete. The weak species that had been dismissed as irrelevant to galactic security had become the teachers who would reshape how every civilization in the galaxy understood warfare itself. And in doing so, they had created something that neither the Devourers nor any other threat could adapt to fast enough to overcome. For the first time since the ancient enemy had returned from the galactic void, Zethak felt genuinely confident about the future. The Devourers had taught the galaxy to fear through their ability to adapt to any challenge, but the humans had taught the galaxy something more powerful than fear. They had taught the galaxy to learn.